What would you do if you suspected your own family member was one of America's most wanted criminals? All your life, you thought this person couldn't be capable of violence, and yet now you were put in front of evidence suggesting they had killed 3 people and hurt dozens of others. Would you try to persuade them to stop or talk to authorities? Or would you do nothing at all? Back in 1995, David Kaczynski was asking himself the very same questions. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you for joining today. And I debated on pushing pause on releasing new episodes after the last couple of weeks we've had. After seeing the grieving families of the recent mass shootings, and then right after that, you see groups of politicians from both sides of the aisle turning it into some sort of political circus. One side thinks the issue is guns and the ease and ability of getting them, regardless of background. And the other side thinks that more guns is the answer, arming teachers and faculty, having more resource officers patrolling, more locked doors. And there are honestly points to be made on both sides of this, and I hope that there is some sort of action taken, but the solution isn't turning our schools into prison. The solution isn't taking the guns from the responsible gun owners. In my opinion, the root cause of this issue is the mental health crisis that's going on in this country right now. I think that all sides can agree with the fact that the common denominator in nearly every mass shooting that we've had, the perpetrator has had mental illness to some varying degree or another. And very few of them have sought meaningful treatment. They've walled off most of their friends and family. And the reason I didn't pause these episodes until I'm sure that we're all in a better mental space about this is for one main reason. The details of these stories that you hear me talking about are interesting and entertaining to pass the time, but the very large majority of them shed a spotlight on what I just mentioned, unchecked mental illness. That's been an unspoken common theme that you may have picked up on from the beginning of this podcast when it started a couple of years ago. It's my hope that your takeaway from this podcast is that mental health issues, mental illness, is a real thing. It affects real people and people that you don't even realize in your family, your friend circle. Some of them may be dealing with mental health issues. Of course, not on the level always of becoming a murderer, but maybe. The point is that you don't know. And the murderers you hear me talking about on this podcast, for the most part, are neighbors with ordinary people. People like you and me. They have family and friends, and their lives intersect with people that have no idea what demons they're fighting internally. The stigma of being mentally ill is thankfully changing. More people are seeking treatment than ever before, and treatment is more available than it ever has been. But there are still those walking among us that are one manic episode away or one insult away from doing unspeakable things to other human beings. So I'm asking that you pay close attention to the people around you. Help them get help if they need it. Call the authorities if you think it's gone beyond some sort of intervention. To me, genuine compassion for others will go a long way in saving future lives. That and not making guns available to people with a history of violence or mental illness. Let's try that for starters. Okay, now let's get to the story today. It all began on May 25th, 1978, when a professor at Northwestern University, Buckley Crist, found himself in a weird situation. Someone had noticed a package in a parking lot at the University of Illinois at Chicago with Buckley's returning address written on it. But the professor said that the box that was given back to him, he had never seen it before in his life. He felt suspicious, so the professor requested help from the campus police, which was a smart move for Buckley, but not so great for Officer Terry Marker, who opened the box, causing it to explode in his hands. Officer Marker survived with minor injuries, mainly because the person who sent the package was still learning. He would hone his craft over time. Within the next 7 years, several bombs exploded at universities in Michigan, Berkeley, Nashville, and Utah. In 1979, one of the attacks targeted American Airlines Flight 444 between Chicago and Washington. While the plane landed safely, The case was now on the FBI's desk, but they just couldn't find the bomber in time. After 10 packages that had only injured the unfortunate person who happened to open them, the 11th one proved fatal. In December 1985, a nail and splinter-loaded bomb sent to a Sacramento computer store exploded and killed the 38-year-old owner, Hugh Scruton. Another one injured a man named Gary Wright at a computer store's parking lot in Salt Lake City. When he picked up the piece of lumber-looking device, it exploded, severing his nerves in his arm and propelling over 200 pieces of shrapnel into his body. According to the man himself, it was like being impaled by a porcupine. Up until this point, the mystery bomber had been like a ghost, nobody ever seeing him sending his packages. But in Salt Lake City, that changed. A man wearing a hooded sweatshirt and aviator glasses was spotted placing the bomb. The sighting resulted in the infamous sketch of the person everybody would come to know as the Unabomber. The FBI referred to the case as Unabomb, UNABOM, meaning University and Airline Bomber. He did, of course, later target computer stores, but it was too late to change the name. After the sketch of the Unabomber was published, he went MIA for 6 years before coming back for 6 more attacks between June 1993 and April 1995. Altogether, 3 people were killed and 23 injured using 26 bombs within 17 years. Somehow, this guy had been able to hide from authorities for almost 2 decades. However, as soon as the Unabomber sent his 35,000-word essay titled Industrial Society and Its Future to the media, his days were numbered. The Unabomber's manifesto was all about, as its instruction says, quote, the Industrial Revolution and how its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. That explained how this guy chose his targets, but there was something far more important in those 35,000 words. The way the Unabomber spoke. Before the manifesto had even been published, a woman named Linda Patrick had had some suspicions that she knew who the Unabomber was. And when she read the essay, it confirmed that Linda knew she was right. She asked her husband David Kaczynski to read it too, and his jaw literally dropped within the first few pages. David noticed a curious sentence about modern philosophers and how they were not, quote, cool-headed logicians. Someone had once used that exact same phrase and said to David that he was not a cool-headed logician. His own brother, Theodore Kaczynski. According to his parents, Ted was not the easiest child. At times, he was well-behaved and attached to his family, and the very next moment he would shut down, refuse to speak, and stay alone in his attic room for hours. Ted's mother, Wanda, was so worried about her son's lack of social skills, she used lemonade and cookies to lure neighborhood children over, hoping Ted would make even just one friend. But nothing really helped. Ted would live half his life as a recluse, hating the world around him. Still, Ted was actually extraordinarily intelligent, skipping 2 grades during his early education and scoring a 170 on an IQ test, meaning he was technically smarter than Einstein. On top of everything, at the age of 16, Ted entered Harvard University, where he took part in a psychological experiment conducted by Professor Henry A. Murray. That particular experiment included extensive verbal abuse, which likely didn't do any good to Ted's already troubled psyche. He eventually became a teacher, but he struggled to be in contact with his students, so Ted finally gave up and abandoned his academic career in 1969 to pursue a primitive life. Ted ended up building himself a small cabin in the woods near Lincoln, Montana. There he lived without electricity, without technology, and almost without human contact. But of course, just isolating himself was not enough for Ted Kaczynski. He wanted to make people understand how technology was ruining not just his life, but the human way of life. So in his tiny cabin, Ted began to build bombs. Some of them he mailed to his targets, and others he personally delivered. And the thing to note here is that Ted's goal was to only get as much attention as possible to his manifesto rather than mass killings. And you would think a person as smart as him could come up with a more peaceful idea, but somehow Ted thought that violence was the answer. For 17 years, Ted continued sending his packages all over, before finally ordering the media to publish his essay. At that moment, Ted himself ended his crusade. Ted's brother and sister-in-law were way too familiar with his strange writing style after reading his letters during the years. As said before, David needed to basically read the first sentence of the manifesto and he knew who the Unabomber was. After taking a deep breath, David shared his suspicions with the FBI, and federal investigators arrested Ted Kaczynski at his cabin on April 3, 1996. Before his trial, Ted first tried to kill himself in January 1998, then ordered his lawyer not to use any type of insanity defense, denied he was in any way mentally ill, wanted to represent himself, and just after his request was rejected, Ted decided to plead guilty to 13 federal bombing-related charges. Everybody sighed in relief when he was finally sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, only hoping that someone sharing Ted's ideology would not someday follow in his footsteps. That's today's 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. Thanks for listening today, and because I didn't give myself enough time at the beginning to mention it, make sure you are subscribed to the podcast so that you don't miss any future episodes. Connect on social media and see the visuals that go along with the episodes, and you can also message me there if you want to send me stories that you'd like me to cover, or if you have a good banana bread recipe to share, send that too. And some of you have been sending me photos of you out and about wearing your 10-Minute Murder t-shirts. So that's cool, and I like seeing that. BTW, if you want a shirt, there's a merch link in the show notes of this and every episode of 10-Minute Murder. Thank you for listening. Be safe and make good choices.